The crystal glass slipped from my hand, just as the laughter hit its cruelest note. Champagne fizzed across the white linen, catching the chandelier light like tiny sparks of mockery. I stood there, smiling through the sting, every heartbeat echoing louder than the orchestra behind me. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the first to make you feel invisible. I remember the way Samantha's eyes gleamed that night, how her voice sliced through my dignity as easily as silk. No one in that room knew the truth. Not yet. That was the moment everything started to unravel. The string quartet played softly in the corner, their notes floating under the crystal chandeliers. The room was drenched in light and laughter, filled with people dressed in their best. People who smiled too wide and spoke too sweetly when they didn't mean a word of it. I stood near the edge of it all, clutching my small silver purse, pretending the tremor in my hand was just age. It wasn't. It was humiliation. It happened so quickly. One careless remark, one smug little laugh from Samantha, and suddenly the air around me turned sharp. I could feel the eyes on my back, the whispers rippling through the tables like a draft of cold wind. She didn't have to raise her voice. Her words carried perfectly across the polished marble floors. The message was clear. I didn't belong in her perfect little world. Not today, not ever. I smiled, because that's what you do when the knife goes in. You smile and hold your head high, even when your heart stings like it's been scraped raw. I told myself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of these people who would love to see me break. It was Lily's wedding day, and I refused to cast a shadow on her happiness. So I stood still, feeling the heat of my own humiliation rise up my neck, and I swallowed it down like poison. Samantha laughed again, that brittle, confident laugh that always made me think of glass about to crack. She had no idea what she'd just done. No idea who she was really speaking to. If only she'd known who really owned the place. People always assume that distance in a family happens all at once. A single argument, a sharp word, a slammed door. But that's not how it was for us. With Daniel and Samantha, it happened quietly, almost politely. One skipped Sunday dinner, one forgotten birthday, one unanswered call at a time. Before I knew it, my own son had become a guest in my life. After my husband passed, I thought the emptiness in the house was the hardest part. But it wasn't the silence that hurt. It was realizing how small I'd become in their world. Samantha had a way of making me feel like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer, something once cherished, but no longer relevant. She wasn't cruel. Not exactly. Just polished in that effortless way that made everything about her seem more modern, more appropriate. I told myself not to take it personally. I busied my hands, tending the garden, volunteering at church, keeping the same little house Daniel grew up in. I never asked for help, even when the bills pressed close. There's a certain kind of pride that keeps you standing when the world forgets to notice you. Lily was my saving grace. Every Sunday, without fail. She'd show up at my door with coffee and a laugh that filled the kitchen. She never treated me like a burden. She'd sit at the table, talking about her dreams, the career she wanted, the man she loved, the wedding she hoped for one day. I'd listen, smiling, though deep down I knew how expensive dreams could be. I remember the day she showed me the photo of the ballroom she'd fallen in love with. Chandeliers like starlight, a place far beyond anything she or Daniel could afford. She sighed, saying it was impossible. I didn't say a word. I just smiled and folded the picture into my purse because I'd already made a promise to myself. One last promise. I would make her dream come true, no matter what it took. I still remember the morning everything changed. It was early, pale light just beginning to spill through the kitchen window, the smell of coffee filling the room. I had bought the ticket on a whim, tucked it between a grocery receipt and a church flyer, and forgot about it for days. When I finally checked the numbers, I just sat there at the table, staring at the screen. $52 million. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. I didn't scream or cry. I just felt this strange, quiet gratitude, like God had reached down and handed me a second chance. Not to live grandly, but to live meaningfully. I thought about Daniel and Samantha, about how money had built walls instead of bridges between us. And I decided right then no one would know. I didn't want apologies bought with curiosity or affection wrapped in greed. I wanted to see who still looked me in the eye with kindness when they thought I had nothing. So I stayed in my little house. I still shopped with coupons, still drove my old Buick, still baked pies for the church fundraiser. But behind that ordinary life, I began quietly building something beautiful. I bought Brookside Country Club, the place Lily had once called her dream. The ballroom had been falling apart, but I saw what it could be. I restored every detail: the chandeliers, the marble floors, the garden archway where she wanted to say her vows. It became my secret project, a gift waiting for the right moment. As the renovations neared completion, I found myself standing in the empty hall one afternoon, sunlight dancing across the polished floors. I could almost hear the music, the laughter, Lily's laughter. I smiled then, knowing that soon my two worlds would collide: the humble grandmother they dismissed, and the woman who owned everything they worshipped. The morning of Lily's wedding felt like stepping into a dream I had spent years building in secret. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that only seems to appear on the happiest days. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Brookside ballroom, scattering across the chandeliers I'd chosen myself. Every corner gleamed, white roses lining the aisle, soft music drifting through the air, laughter echoing faintly from the courtyard. It was everything Lily had ever wanted. I sat quietly near the back, my hands folded in my lap, watching her glide down the aisle with that same bright joy she'd carried since she was a little girl. I felt my heart swell. Pride, love, and a quiet ache all tangled together. For a few moments, I forgot everything else. I was just a grandmother, watching her granddaughter's dream come true. But happiness, in my life, never seemed to last long before someone tried to tarnish it. I noticed Samantha first, that practiced smile, sharp as glass. She moved through the crowd like she owned the air itself, pausing to whisper here and there. People's glances began to shift toward me. Some smiled politely, others looked away too quickly. I could feel the judgment ripple, subtle but unmistakable. It started small, a quiet comment that traveled faster than sound ever could. Something about my dress being too simple, my seat being too far from the family table. I pretended not to notice, focusing instead on Lily's laughter as she twirled on the dance floor. But the whispers kept growing. pulling me back into the same familiar humiliation I'd once thought I'd grown immune to. Then came the final blow. Samantha, in her flawless gown, approached with that same rehearsed charm, her words coated in honey and poison. She gestured toward me as if I were some misplaced guest, someone who didn't belong in a room this beautiful. The crowd followed her lead, their eyes quiet but complicit. I felt the sting rise in my chest, not anger, but something colder, a deep, aching disappointment. I straightened my back, forcing myself to breathe slowly. I had been invisible to her for years, dismissed as an inconvenience, and yet she still found ways to remind me of it. My hands trembled slightly, but I clasped them together, refusing to let her see my pain. The music softened. A moment of silence hung heavy in the air. Samantha turned to the event coordinator, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention. She said she wanted to thank the person who owned this magnificent venue, whoever had made this day possible. And then she turned back toward me with that patronizing smile, her tone dripping with false sweetness. She wanted to meet the owner. I smiled then, small, calm, unbothered, because the moment she had unknowingly invited was the one I had been waiting for all along. For a few seconds after Samantha's words, the entire ballroom seemed to freeze. The music faded, laughter evaporated, and all that remained was the sound of soft murmurs and clinking glasses. I could feel every pair of eyes shift toward me, curious, judgmental, expectant. It would have been easy to shrink back, to pretend not to notice, to let the moment pass. That's what the old me might have done. But not today. I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing the fabric of my dress. My hands were steady. My heart was not racing, not this time. As I walked toward the center of the room, I could sense the confusion ripple through the guests. The same people who had just looked past me now couldn't look away. Samantha stood frozen, her polished confidence cracking around the edges. I stopped just beside her, taking in the sight of the grand hall, the chandeliers, the marble floors, the very air humming with silence. And in that stillness, I finally spoke the truth I had kept tucked away for years. Not with pride, not with vengeance, just calm certainty. This place was mine. The weight of it settled into the room like a thunderclap without sound. I watched the recognition bloom across faces. Surprise, disbelief, even shame. Daniel's eyes widened, searching mine for an explanation. Samantha blinked, her smile faltering, her throat tightening as the realization took hold. In that moment, I felt no triumph, only release. For so long, I had been the quiet shadow in their story, the one they pitied or ignored. But standing there, surrounded by the beauty I had built, I realized I no longer needed anyone's permission to exist in full light. The music swelled again, tentative at first. The whispers turned softer, uncertain. I turned away, leaving Samantha and her silence behind, the sound of my footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stands up and lets the truth speak for itself. And as I walked toward the garden doors, I could feel the next secret stirring just beneath the surface, one they weren't ready to hear yet. When the silence of that revelation began to settle, my mind drifted, not to the crowd, or Samantha's pale face, or even Daniel's confusion, but to him, my husband, the man everyone thought had left me with nothing but a small pension and a house barely worth keeping. The truth, I learned years later, was something else entirely. It happened quietly, on a rainy afternoon not long after his funeral. I was sorting through boxes in the attic when I found a sealed envelope tucked inside his old briefcase. Inside was a letter from his lawyer, and beneath it, his handwriting. The trust had been established years before he passed, a quiet plan designed to ensure I'd be safe, even if our son grew distant. Every word felt like hearing his voice again, steady, loving, thoughtful. He must have known that Daniel's pride would get in the way, that money could corrode what love alone couldn't mend. For a long time, I couldn't decide how to feel. Grateful. Yes. Protected. Certainly. But there was also sorrow. A deep, aching sorrow that he'd felt the need to protect me from our own child. I often wondered if Daniel's bitterness came from believing I'd kept something from him. Maybe, in his eyes, my survival looked like selfishness. Maybe that's why the warmth between us cooled so easily. Money is strange that way. It reveals what love hides, and hides what love reveals. Owning Brookside was never about proving anything. It was never revenge or pride. It was about him, about the promise he made to keep me safe, even after he was gone, and about Lily, the one piece of our family that still remembered how to love without conditions. As I watched her dance that night, her laughter filling the same air that once felt heavy with secrets, I realized the truth. This wasn't just my husband's legacy or my quiet victory. It was a chance to give our family one last, fragile moment of grace before everything unraveled again. And deep down, I could already sense it, the calm before another storm. The moment the truth rippled through the ballroom, it was as if the air itself shifted. Whispers turned into waves. People who had spent the evening smiling politely now looked at Samantha and Daniel with a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. The woman who had strutted across the floor with effortless control now stood frozen, her perfect composure unraveling like thread pulled too far. I didn't need to say another word. The silence said enough. Samantha's voice, the one that always filled every room, now stumbled over excuses. She blamed the planner, the miscommunication, the confusion about the venue. But people saw through her. The guests exchanged looks, and a few quietly stepped away. Her charm, her social poise, all of it began to crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. Daniel tried to salvage the moment, offering awkward smiles, pretending nothing had happened, but I could see it in his eyes. The dawning realization that this wasn't about embarrassment. It was about everything he had chosen to ignore for years. His mother, standing there quietly with dignity, was the same woman he'd dismissed as small, as ordinary, and now he couldn't meet my gaze. Through it all, I remained still. My heart beat steadily, not with pride, but with peace. I didn't need to defend myself. The truth had already done that for me. Then I saw Lily. Her face, once glowing with joy, was now shadowed by heartbreak. She had always wanted harmony, a family that loved without conditions. Watching her parents bicker in whispers and avoid the truth broke something in her. She turned toward me, hesitant at first, then certain, and in front of everyone, she came to me. She wrapped her arms around me, holding tight, trembling but strong. The crowd fell quiet again. In that moment, everything that mattered stood in the open, not wealth, not pride, not appearances, but love. Simple, unconditional, unshaken love. I held her close, feeling her tears against my shoulder, and I realized something profound. This was never about ownership or revenge. It was about reclaiming peace. For myself, for her, for the memory of what family was supposed to mean. And as the music softly resumed, I felt an overwhelming calm wash over me. The storm had finally broken, and in its quiet aftermath, truth had done what it always does. It had set everything free. When the music faded and the last of the guests drifted away, the night finally exhaled. I stood alone in the quiet of the garden, the lanterns still glowing softly in the trees. The chaos, the whispers, the looks, all of it had melted into silence. What lingered wasn't anger or pride. It was peace. I thought about everything that had happened, the years of distance, the humiliation, the truth that had finally come to light. For so long, I'd carried the weight of being overlooked, of loving without being seen. But tonight, I understood something simple and profound. Dignity doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to win. It just needs to endure. People often mistake kindness for weakness. They think silence means surrender. But there's a quiet kind of strength in walking away from cruelty without letting it change you. That's what I learned. That real victory isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about staying kind, even when they don't deserve it. I watched Lily across the courtyard, laughing softly with her new husband, her hand resting gently in his. The light from the chandeliers framed her like the promise of a new beginning. She looked free, untangled from the bitterness that had haunted our family for years. In her, I saw everything I'd ever hoped for: the courage to love openly, to forgive deeply, to start fresh. As I turned to leave, the night air felt warm against my skin. I realized that sometimes peace doesn't come from fixing what's broken. It comes from finally letting it be. And for the first time in a long while, I felt whole again, ready to share what this journey had truly taught me. Looking back, I realize life has a way of humbling us before it heals us. I spent years believing silence meant weakness, that forgiveness made me small. But now I understand. Strength isn't in fighting back. It's in refusing to let bitterness shape who you are. That night at Lily's wedding, I didn't just reclaim my dignity. I rediscovered my peace. The truth came out, yes, but more importantly, I found the courage to stand tall without needing to hurt anyone in return. That's what grace really is: choosing calm when chaos calls your name. Money fades, pride fades, even memory fades, but kindness, the kind that costs nothing and changes everything, that's what lasts. I've learned that true wealth isn't found in what we own, but in how we live, how we love, and how we rise when life tries to break us. If you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated, I hope my story reminds you that your worth doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. Stay gentle, stay grounded, Thank you for listening to my story. And if you've ever had a moment where grace won over anger, I'd love to hear it. Share it in the comments. I read every single one.